Imagine a bitterly cold November morning in 1489, frost crystallizing over the rooftops of Westminster Palace, where inside, amid whispers of courtiers and the soft glow of candlelight, a child's cry announces the arrival of Margaret Tudor. Born to King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, Margaret entered a kingdom still scarred from the brutality of the Wars of the Roses, battles that had ripped apart families and drained England of peace. Her parents' marriage was more than mere affection. It was a calculated alliance, a union bridging the rival houses of Lancaster and York, aiming to bind wounds and secure a fragile dynasty. From the moment she took her first breath, Margaret's life was shaped not by her desires, but by duty, destined to become a political chess piece in the high-stakes game between nations. Yet, even amid the constraints of royalty, she forged her own way through scandal, heartbreak, and fierce defiance. A princess determined not just to survive, but to claim her own agency in a world where women held little power. Henry VII had come to the throne in 1485, determined to secure a stable Tudor dynasty. He recognized that forging peace with Scotland was essential to England's northern border. The long-standing animosity between the two kingdoms had produced an almost ceaseless cycle of skirmishes, raids, and treaties that never seemed to hold. Marriage had often proved a valuable diplomatic tool, and so from a young age, Margaret was groomed for a prospective union with the Scottish crown. She was only a child when negotiations began. Indeed, the idea of betrothing her to James IV of Scotland preceded her maturity by many years. As a girl in the Tudor court, Margaret's formal education would not have been as extensive as a boy's, but she would have learned enough reading, writing, French, music, and etiquette to become an accomplished princess suitable for a foreign monarch. She also likely absorbed the protocols of courtly behavior, the careful dance of alliances, and the need to guard one's words in the presence of watchful courtiers. This training would prove essential once she left England for the rougher and more unpredictable environment of the Scottish court. In 1503, at the tender age of 13, Margaret traveled north to marry the 30-year-old James IV. It was hardly a marriage of equals. James was a seasoned king, a warrior known both for his chivalry and for his extramarital exploits that had already produced several illegitimate children. Meanwhile, Margaret was by all accounts still very much a child, uncertain, overshadowed by the imposing figure of her new husband. Yet from the perspective of diplomacy, this was a groundbreaking union. It was formally part of what became known as the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, an ambitious, though ultimately fragile agreement to end hostilities between England and Scotland. At least on paper, the hope was that Margaret's presence in Scotland would help bind the two realms, making her a living symbol of alliance. But as so often with royal marriages, the personal realities soon became entangled in the swirl of political rivalry, clan feuds, and external pressures from the continental powers. Margaret's arrival in Edinburgh was an event of grand pageantry. The Scots went to great lengths to impress their new queen, and perhaps also her father, Henry VII, who had footed many of the expenses. There were processions through the city, lavish feasts, and tournaments where knights in glittering armor jousted in her honor. But the joy and celebration masked underlying tensions. The Scottish court was fractious, full of powerful lords who each had their own interests, and Margaret was an English princess in their midst. In addition, James IV had his own share of complicated relationships. He was charismatic, adored by many, yet he had fathered several children out of wedlock, some of whom were older than Margaret herself. It is not difficult to imagine her sense of disorientation as she tried to form a household of her own, forging friendships among courtiers who may well have viewed her as an outsider or even a potential English spy. During the first decade of her marriage, 1503 to 1513, Margaret's life, key the Scottish coro, was marked by both showy royal duties and quieter frustrations. She performed the ceremonial roles expected of a queen consort, hosting events, receiving ambassadors, and giving away alms to the poor. But she found herself frequently upset by her husband's extramarital dalliances. James IV, while politically astute, was not a model husband. Indeed, few 16th century monarchs were. Margaret could scarcely ignore the presence of James's acknowledged illegitimate children, for whom he provided. Furthermore, each time relations soured between England and Scotland, whether due to border conflicts or larger continental entanglements, Margaret was placed in an impossible position. Was she loyal to her birthplace, her family in England, or to her new home, her husband's kingdom? Tragedy struck in 1513 with the Battle of Flodden, a confrontation that would change Margaret's life forever. James IV chose to support the French in their conflict with England, a decision that put him at odds with Margaret's brother, the newly crowned Henry VIII. On September 9th, 1513, James led the Scottish army south, only to face a crushing defeat at Flodden. He was killed in the fighting, along with countless Scottish nobles, an event that sent shockwaves through the country. The widowed Margaret, still only 23 years old, suddenly found herself at the helm of a kingdom in crisis. She had a toddler son, Prince James, the future James V, who was barely a year old. By Scottish tradition, the young prince was now king, and Margaret was named regent. It was a power rarely bestowed on a woman, especially one who was not Scottish by birth, and who possessed a direct familial tie to the King of England. Stepping into her role as regent in 1513, Margaret faced a host of challenges. She was in mourning for her husband, worried about the security of her infant son, and uncertain how to deal with the fractious Scottish lords. Some advisors cast aspersions on her because she was English, suspecting that she might place England's interests before Scotland's. Others found a female regent inherently problematic. The tradition of male guardianship was strong, and many lords were quick to test the boundaries of her authority. Margaret's position was precarious at best. One might expect that her brother Henry VIII would rally to her support. Yet he had his own preoccupations, including wars in France and the challenge of producing an heir. Moreover, the precarious alliance between England and Scotland had been shattered by Flodden, leaving Margaret in the unenviable position of being an Englishwoman leading a country that was reeling from a catastrophic defeat inflicted by English forces. Despite these difficulties, Margaret showed considerable political skill early in her regency. She brokered peace agreements, sought to stabilize the borders, and worked to secure her son's succession. Yet her personal life would soon become a political stumbling block. In August 1514, only a year after James IV's death, Margaret shocked the Scottish nobility by remarrying. Her new husband was Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus, an influential noble from the powerful Douglas clan. From a romantic perspective, perhaps Margaret yearned for companionship after her traumatic loss. From a political standpoint, however, this was a disastrous move. The marriage enraged many Scottish lords, who believed Margaret was trampling on her widow's privileges and ignoring the expectation that she remain a neutral regent. Indeed, some suspected that her quick remarriage indicated a desire to bolster her personal power or to form a faction loyal to her. Even more damaging, the marriage gave ammunition to those who argued she was unfit to rule and that the regency should pass to someone else, particularly John Stuart, Duke of Albany, a man with royal blood who stood next in line to the throne should young James V die. Before long, Margaret's second marriage fell into disarray. The marriage to Angus was marked by mutual suspicion and apparently infidelity on Angus's part. He took advantage of Margaret's position and finances, fueling resentment and leading to arguments that spilled over into the realm of public scandal. By 1515, Margaret was pregnant, but the political situation in Scotland was so tense that she feared for her safety. The Duke of Albany had returned from exile in France, vying to take control of the regency. Margaret's prospects of maintaining authority seemed grim. Not only was she an English-born widow of a late king, but she was also now bound to a controversial noble who had many enemies. In a desperate move, she fled across the border into England, seeking refuge on the soil of her birth. Margaret arrived in England in a precarious state, heavily pregnant, emotionally strained, and uncertain of the welcome she would receive. She ended up at Harbottle Castle, where in October 1515 she gave birth to a daughter, Margaret Douglas. This newborn girl would later have her own share of controversy, becoming entangled in the marital and succession issues of the Tudor court. But that lay far in the future. For now, Margaret Tudor was an exiled queen dowager, reliant on the goodwill of her brother, Henry VIII. Henry had complex reactions to his sister's plight. On one hand, he recognized an opportunity to influence Scottish affairs through her. On the other, he found her repeated demands for financial and military support burdensome, especially when he was embroiled in European conflicts of his own. After about 2 years, Margaret returned to Scotland in 1517 or so, hoping to reclaim some measure of authority and perhaps salvage her marriage to Angus. Neither goal would prove successful. Angus's infidelities and financial manipulations continued, and the Scottish political scene was dominated by the Duke of Albany. Increasingly desperate, Margaret pleaded with Henry VIII and even the Pope to grant her a divorce. The notion of a queen dowager, once regent of Scotland, seeking to dissolve her marriage was scandalous in a deeply Catholic nation, well before the Reformation controversies fully exploded. Many in Scotland saw this as yet another sign that Margaret was too flighty, too governed by personal passion. Divorce was not a straightforward matter. In the early 16th century, it required ecclesiastical approvals that could take years, especially for someone of Margaret's stature. It was not until 1527 that she finally obtained a papal sanction for her divorce from Angus. By that point, the marriage had been thoroughly discredited by Angus's misdeeds and Margaret's unwavering determination to extricate herself. Yet no sooner had she secured the divorce than she shocked everyone again by rushing into a third marriage. This time to Henry Stuart, who would later become Lord Methven. As with Angus, Margaret's relationship with Methven would degenerate over time. She would complain that her third husband was unfaithful and unscrupulous about finances, lamenting that fortune had ill-fated her in the matter of husbands. No doubt some in Scotland viewed it with cynicism. The Queen Dowager's repeated matrimonial leaps seemed to confirm her as an impulsive, passionate woman, prone to entangle herself in controversies that undermined any moral or political authority she might have claimed. Throughout these personal dramas, Margaret's relationship with her only surviving son, King James V, became increasingly fraught. In 1528, James took control of Scotland, effectively ending the regency. Though he was still in his mid-teens, James was determined to assert himself. He had seen how English influence, courtesy of his mother's birth and her appeals to Henry VIII, threatened to overshadow Scotland's independence. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself in a precarious position, attempting to maintain a connection with her family in England without alienating Scottish nobility or her own son. At times, James V seemed to resent Margaret's meddling in matters of state or her repeated intrigues with various noble factions. Whispers circulated that Margaret might be planning to abscond to England with her third husband, taking wealth or secrets with her, rumors that stoked James's suspicion. In 1537, tensions flared again. The story goes that Margaret was rumored to be planning an escape to England, possibly as a ploy to secure Henry VIII's support against her unfaithful third spouse. Whatever the truth of the matter, James V reacted harshly, at least temporarily confiscating some of her properties. For a time, the mother-son bond seemed dangerously frayed, yet they managed a fragile reconciliation, driven partly by mutual necessity. Margaret, despite her missteps, remained a valuable figure who could negotiate with Henry VIII, and James, for all his mistrust, recognized that her presence at court carried symbolic weight. She was the link between the Tudors and the Stuarts, a reminder that James himself was part Tudor by blood, a fact that would have profound consequences for the future unification of the crowns. Amid these political entanglements, Margaret suffered personal heartbreak after heartbreak. Of the 6 children she bore James IV, only one survived to adulthood, James V. The others died in infancy or childhood, each loss a gut-wrenching blow that left her increasingly isolated and anxious. She had also witnessed the precarious fortunes of her daughter, Margaret Douglas, who at one point found herself imprisoned in England due to her involvement in romances that threatened to disrupt Henry VIII's court politics. Worse still was the perpetual drama of Margaret's own marriages, which offered little emotional stability. Her second marriage had collapsed in scandal. Her third gave her little joy. Methven, though perhaps less politically significant than Angus, still contributed to her sense of betrayal and loneliness through his infidelity. By the 1530s, Margaret Tudor was no longer the youthful, dazzling princess who had first arrived in Edinburgh. She was aging, her health compromised by stress, repeated pregnancies, heartbreak, and, according to some accounts, a tendency towards overeating, something that was not uncommon for royals during times of depression. Given that feasting was one of the few pleasures they were expected to indulge publicly, she found herself short of funds, largely abandoned by her third husband, who was more interested in preserving his own position. Henry VIII, always focused on his own dynastic crises, offered only minimal financial support. Thus, the woman who had once been crowned Queen of Scots lived in near-reduced circumstances, reliant on the grudging generosity of the Scottish court and her son's shifting sympathies. It was against this backdrop of cumulative disappointments that Margaret's health began to deteriorate. She suffered from what might have been high blood pressure or other stress-related ailments, a condition not well understood by the medical practices of the time. By 1541, she was in her early 50s, an age that, by the standards of the 16th century, made her something of an elder stateswoman, yet she was far from enjoying the revered status of a dowager queen in peaceful retirement. Instead, she was living at Methven Castle, overshadowed by the failures of her marriages, overshadowed by a tense relationship with her son, overshadowed by the unstoppable influence of Henry VIII on the broader stage of British politics. In that year, on October 18th, Margaret suffered what was likely a stroke and passed away at the age of 51. Her death was a relatively quiet affair, no lavish funeral comparable to the celebrations that had marked her wedding decades earlier. She was laid to rest in Perth with minimal fanfare, a subdued ceremony that belied the dramatic life she had led. Some historians note that she and James V finally reconciled shortly before her death, fulfilling her dying wish to secure peace between mother and son. If that is true, it may have provided her with at least a modicum of solace. The subsequent events would add a final tragic coda. James V himself died the following year in 1542, leaving behind an infant daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, who would go on to inherit the same storms of political turmoil and personal tragedy that had hounded Margaret's footsteps. Although Margaret's story faded from the forefront of popular memory, often overshadowed by her far more notorious brother, Henry VIII, her legacy was profound. Through her marriage to James IV, she became the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the great-grandmother of James VI of Scotland, who eventually ascended the English throne as James I of England. In 1603, this dynastic shift, known as the Union of the Crowns, effectively united England and Scotland under a single monarch, a milestone that altered the trajectory of the British Isles. All of this sprang, in some sense, from Margaret's marriage, the product of that Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which, ironically, never yielded true lasting peace during her lifetime, but did set the stage for eventual unification. That unity would not come until 1603, long after Margaret's life and death. But it was her bloodline that ultimately merged the two monarchies, a fact that no scandal, divorce, or misfortune could undo. Henry VIII's reign is remembered for its break with Rome and his 6 wives. James IV is lauded for his chivalric court and lamented for his downfall at Flodden. James V is recognized for his more cautious, if still troubled reign. And Mary, Queen of Scots, is famed for her tragic captivity and execution. Yet, none of these figures can be fully understood without acknowledging Margaret Tudor's role in bridging 2 realms, forging alliances and bearing the children who would inherit and further complicate the entire tapestry of British royal lineage. Overlooked or minimized by some historians of previous generations, Margaret now stands more clearly revealed, a determined, fallible, and ultimately influential queen whose life set the stage for one of the most significant dynastic unions in European history.